you know, the main destination was Milan. And however, Bologna became quite soon the second more important city for the Chinese community. And in Bologna they arrived during the 30s. For the first time, the presence of some Chinese vendors was noticed in Bologna in 1926. And that was a particular year in the sense that a lot of vendors of fake pearls started to be noticed everywhere in Italy, in different cities. And there was also some protests in the sense that shopkeepers started to protest against the arrival of these street vendors that were not the price, of course. But anyway, very soon they started to ask for the permission, and the situation became very legal. And so in 1926 also the first vendors arrived in Bologna. Some of them decided to settle there, and after the Second World War, some decided to return to China, and some of them then decided to come back to Italy, and so. Anyway, in 1945, the members of the Chinese community in Bologna was composed of about 25-30 people, and most of them were street vendors. But we have to say that part of them have already started to produce some kind of goods, above all ties, silk ties, and leatherette bags. And I forgot to tell you, you can see here the distribution of the Chinese migrants in Italy during the interwar years. And the most interesting thing is that apart from Milan, where was set up the most important community, the huge community, and the other Chinas distribute themselves all over Italy. And the reason was that they were street vendors. And so when new migrants arrived, they used to move to new cities. And anyway, since before the Second World War, some started to set up workshops to produce leather bags and silk ties. And these activities, little by little, developed. And as you can see from this picture, that represent the setting up of new Chinese workshop in Bologna. The number of these workshops started to grow during the 60s and reached a peak at the beginning of the 70s. Then the number became more or less stable. And you can see here some of these. This was a workshop, Paolo, and we interviewed the wife of this craftsman, and that was silk. In the other picture, you can see one of the silk tie produced by Wang Chongming. That was one of the first to settle down in Punto. And this is a picture of a family. And this is interesting because most of these migrants were male, and after some years they got married with Italian wives. And this was an important part of their integration in the Bologna community, in the sense that wives were important to build a relationship above all from the economic point of view with the other Italian enterprises. But we have to say that the link with the Chinese community was very strong, and usually wives were included in the Chinese community, not the opposite. And the evolution, the development of these leather bags district in Bologna was part of the economic development of the city after the Second World War. And as you know, Bologna completed the industrialization during the 50s and the 60s, above all specializing in the engineering sector. However, during the 50s and the 60s, also an important leather district developed in the city, producing not only bags but also shoes. And so, according to the Chamber of Commerce data, in 1970, there were about 300 enterprises in the leather district working leather. And about 70 of them were run by Chinese migrants. So an important part of the leather district of Bologna. So Chinese migrants specialized in the leather bags. But this wasn't an enclave, in the sense that leather was cheaper than leather. That's why they specialized in this particular kind of bags. But their economic activity was very well integrated with the economic fabric of the city, and they interacted continuously with Italian enterprises. For instance, they bought the raw materials from Italian enterprises, from Italian wholesalers, and they sold their bags to Italian retailers. And also they use a lot of female laborers to sew bags. So that wasn't an enclave, but it was part of the district, the Bologna district in the leather sector. And I have time to say. And so one of the most important aspects is their ability to interconnect with the rest of the city and of the economy of the city. The other aspect is the strong ties, family ties, kinship ties, which characterize this community. In the sense that when new migrants arrived, they were helped by the old migrants. In the sense that the old migrants provided them both knowledge to start a workshop, to start the leather bag production, and also credit for the new activities. And during the interview, one of the wives, the interview, she said that she had a book, and she had a notebook, and this notebook, there was the name of each Chinese people in Bologna that lent them money to start the activity. And then that in 1 year or two they were able to repay these, back these loans, and also to buy their house. And we were during the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. So strong community ties, and to connect this aspect with the Negroni, that is not here, but Professor Negroni's presentation, and the kind of nectar, we can define this kind of nectar as sort of complete nectar, in the sense that even if there was a leader in the Chinese community, there is always a leader in this community, there was always, and the connection between all the other people were very important. And these are also this activity of borrowing knowledge and credit was developed in between a variety of connections and it wasn't organized by the leader. And well, the consequence of all that is that also the social integration was quite good, even if we have to say that the language problem was very important, because they didn't speak Mandarin, they spoke a dialect, and they didn't want to transmit this dialect to their sons and daughters. And so the second generation didn't speak Mandarin. The second generation spoke no Mandarin nor dialect. They lost the language of the father. And they were a community, they met regularly, and they helped each other. And after this first generation, there were different generations of migration in Bologna as in the rest of Italy. This is a picture of the Chinese club, the China club in Bologna. And you can see they were all men, because men met there. And women used to meet in different situations.
In the kitchen.
And for instance, this kind of situation, birthday and community. Anyway, if we want to come back to the district, the leather district, during the 80s and the 90s, the leather district in Bologna changed completely. Many workshops closed, both Italian and Chinese workshops closed down, and at the end, only some middle-sized enterprises survived. And that were the one able to adapt their strategies to the new image of culture, to the new culture, to the new image culture that were emerging during the 80s and 90s. And it's quite interesting the fact that no Chinese workshop was able to introduce strong brands and to adapt their strategies to this new image culture. Okay. I go with London.
Okay, there are strong similarities to the case of Bologna. If we consider the case of London, Berlin, the first Chinese workers who reached London were sailors that were hired by British vessels, and they started entrepreneurial activity in Limehouse. Limehouse was really the first Chinatown in London, where all the Chinese seamen stopped and went to rest, and sometimes decided to stay on and start up new businesses. So something that really came from the sea, in this case, this presence, and the people who decided to stay opened up the restaurants, cafes, shops, and also laundry shops, especially laundry shops which were working mainly for the ships. So there was a strong interconnections with shipping business. So as laundry business in particular spread all over London, some journalists talked about the Chinese industrial invasion, and actually still in 1911 you can see the occupation of Chinese men in England was really still mainly in merchant navy, almost half of them, and then 30% in laundries and 10% in retail business, including cooks and waiters. And this is a Chinese restaurant in Limehouse. Little by little, the community, the Chinese community in Limehouse grew, and this is very interesting because here we find some of the first resemblances with the case of Italy, because again, this did not happen anymore after the Second World War, but before that, in the 20s and 30s, it was quite common for Chinese men to marry English women. So again, there was this similarity, and so intermarriage was quite common, and also the creation of a community started. So Chinese social clubs were born. China Club, we find the China Club also in Limehouse. Chinese schools were set up to teach Cantonese at that time, and also houses and opium trade was the other business that opened up in Limehouse. However, in this part of the Chinese business was really the main reason why Limehouse ended and the Chinese community in Limehouse ended, because unfortunately, not gambling houses, but opium trade and opium dens were quite a successful business. And unfortunately, in the 1920s and early 30s, with the increase of deaths from opium injection and the opium trade by the Chinese, finally the police intervened and opium dens were closed and many Chinese were left, decided to leave Limehouse. And also, we must take into account the fact that after the 1929 crisis, there was the reflection of the crisis of the Navy business also meant that there was less to do in Limehouse. So if you put the two things together, then you can understand why Limehouse became less and less attractive. And this is the Chinese school in Limehouse on the right, and the Chinese shops to the left. So the Chinese in Limehouse started decreasing after the 1929 crisis. You can see almost half of them, more than half of them, left Limehouse and spread all over London. At the same time, soon after the Second World War, a new influx of Chinese started from Hong Kong. So again, we have two different communities now in London, the old community which spread all over London, and the new community of immigrants, which I call them the new business community, because they went mainly into restaurant and the catering business. So again, it's a big difference, because in this case, while in the first case, in Limehouse, it was the Chinese community, well-integrated Chinese community, which, in Chinese restaurant, in Limehouse, worked mainly for Chinese people from Chinese sailors who stopped and had their food there. And Chinese shops sold things to Chinese restaurants and so on. So, well, this changed after the Second World War. Some English authors say that the success of Chinese restaurants after the Second World War was because colonial officials had acquired a liking for Chinese food. So finally, this restaurant started attracting also British people besides Chinese one. And already in 1961, there were 151 Chinese restaurants in London. And then we have this report, which dates back to the 80s, of the Commission on Racial Equality, which underlines how most Chinese in London at that time were mainly from Hong Kong, and because they could enter freely in London until 1962, because they were Commonwealth citizens, so they had free entry. After that, lesser and lesser, and then finally in 1973, they were not allowed anymore. They were a tight community, the report says, but were still illiterate in English. And this is true for these immigrants and also for the immigrants from the 20s and 30s. The problem was to become literate in English, to learn English. And as in the case of Bologna, family was the basic economic unit, in this case in the catering trade business. And there was a large spreading of restaurants all over London in the 1970s. But the report found no indication of interethnic or interlocking business ties among firms in the food chain. Each firm, each food entrepreneur, or each owner of a restaurant tended to rely on its family to run the business, but it did not have a particular relation and networking with the other Chinese working there. That's what the report said. So there were many common features, some differences. We're still working on the similarities and differences. So among the common features, we can say that in the beginning, at least in both cases, we saw that they were really a real community. They were interconnecting with the local population through their wives. Intermarriage was quite common. And so as the involvement of the wife in the entrepreneurial activity, also in the case of London, the wife or often helping the running of the laundry or the restaurant business. They were linked to the nationalistic government. They, as Patrizia was saying, believed in the Kuomintang, and they also they respect the festivities that they have in China. So it was like a Chinese community really brought to London and Bologna in this case. But of course there were different immigrant waves, as in the case of Bologna after the Second World War. The new wave of immigrants came, as in the case of London, and brought with them different habits, different customs. The fulcrum of the community in both cases, I would say, is the family. Familyism is a very important component of Chinese economic organization and finances. As Patrizia was saying, it's not only the family. I would say it's a little bit larger than the family. Some Chinese who we interviewed in Bologna talked about their Chinese clan, which in one interview said that they went up to the fourth cousin, I think, which meant 50 people, or maybe over than that. So that is considered a family, which is a large amount of people who can help. For instance, in financing the activity, and that's also what we found in Bologna again. So they try to be, they try to rely more on their kinship than on banks or financing from the market, for instance. So the community is a very important part of the economic organization and financing. Then there are some works that suggest that Chinese immigrant entrepreneurs tend to choose areas where they find least competition from local producers, like ethnic business, like Chinese restaurants, or declining business activities. As we've seen, this is true only in part, both in Bologna and in London. Well, as to the isolation of the Chinese business community, again, there are some authors that say that Chinese have this problem of isolation. They maybe the first community of Chinese who came were less isolated than the recent immigrants. And today, some sociologists say that they pass from being marginal workers to marginal proprietors of their shops or restaurants without being really integrated into their community. However, something which really is quite common is the employment of co-ethnics and sometimes illegal immigrants. But the employment of co-ethnics is quite widespread all around both London and Bologna. And sometimes, well, they're linked family members, but sometimes can be also people from the same village or people, relatives that come and find their first job in Bologna or London. We didn't talk about the fact that we were attracted to the study of the Chinese community because they show a high percentage of entrepreneurship. They are the most entrepreneurial community among foreign immigrants. So we chose that because all statistics show this data, which we thought was quite interesting. So if you take all immigrants in Italy, the most entrepreneurial community are the Chinese because they tend to, they come to work for someone else, but also this comes from our interviews as well. What they want to do is to set up their own business. So that's what they really aim at. And then there are some differences, but probably there are others as well. So in Bologna, they participated very well in the leather district in a way that made it possible to distinguish their enterprises from the Italian one. And this is a characteristic that was developed in Bologna, but we didn't see in London. And the employment of Italian labor force in the beginning was quite common in Bologna, while not so much in the London case. If you want to add other community.
Maybe I can add two things. The first one is this attitude to set up new enterprise was so strong that even when sons and daughters became Italy, they set up a new enterprise. They didn't take a share in the family business, but the family stimulated them to start a new small enterprise. And this is a common trait, is a common feature that we found during the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And so a strong attitude to work on their own. And another aspect is that, and this is the difference, I mean, this aspect of the entrepreneurial attitude is a common feature between London and Bologna. And among the difference, we can add the fact that Chinese community in Bologna during the 50s and the 60s participated in the economic miracle of our country. And so they didn't try to work in a declining sector, but they were working in the Asian sector because they were participating in the economic miracle. And as Alberto Rinaldi wrote about the craftsman experience in Italy, the law supported the development of workshop. And so this law that these laws that supported all craftsmen, both Italian and whatever, became an important instrument for the inclusion of migrants in the Chinese case. And so, in absence of any inclusion policy for migration, the integration took shape.
Thank you. I leave the floor to Tito Menzani for studies, and then if you have any questions, raise your hand.
So, good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Tito Menzani. I work at the University of Bologna. I'm an economic and business historian. I appreciate all the papers of this panel, and I think that they can give a significant contribution to this research field that we know that migration and immigration is one of the most important topics of today's political agenda, and we know that history can help us to clarify some process and to fight the stereotype and prejudice. I start with the first paper of my comments, paper by Dario La Losa and Ettore Trovato, that told us different stories. I note Pierre Ravanat, the wood mills, the cotton mills, Guppi, Lindemann, different stories from different sectors in some regions of southern Italy. And they want to highlight through this story the circulation of know-how, and they link these features with the important process of industrialization of the area. They show us many data that compare different regions. So we have both information on a qualitative side and on a quantitative side. I think that the sources contains more information. The prosecution of the research can give something more about the case study about, foreigners-owned firms, for example, to understand the motivation of these entrepreneurs to invest in southern Italy, to understand links and ties between entrepreneurs and local population or stakeholders, to understand if someone, manager or employee, used the skills that learned in the firm in a different context that could be an example of the circulation of know-how. And I think that it will be useful some business histories of these case studies, from the foundation of the enterprise to the most important steps, the changes about technologies, products, and so on. About the second paper that is also related to southern Italy, I appreciated that the focus is on a big social and economic item, that caporalato, and it links the exploitation of immigrants and racism against immigrants. That is a sort of consequence. And this research can carry on in deep, and I know that it's not easy, about a quantitative feature, because I think that it's important to describe this phenomenon also on a statistical side. It's not easy because you told us a dark side of the economy, so we have no official stats about that. But I think that could be an effort to give a quantitative side to the research. Also because you highlighted that this dynamics is not simply typical of Rosarno or 4 or 5 small villages in southern Italy, but involves a lot of regions also in central Italy and in northern Italy. And it's important to give a quantitative idea of the phenomenon. Moreover, I also appreciated the programs to fight this condition through a pact between different stakeholders. I also suggest to include or to consider the network of Libera and its brand Libera Terra, because sometimes we think that the war against criminal organization has no victories, a lot of struggle but no victories, but it isn't so. For example, the law of 1996 that allowed the use of the asset confiscated on the requisitioned to the criminal organization, it's very important because a lot of agricultural lands, some agricultural lands are used in a different context by cooperative that produce ethic goods, and so with no exploitation of workers. About the last paper by Patrizia Battilani and Francesca Fauri, I appreciated a lot the story of these two Chinese communities, and I have a brief consideration about the geographical distribution of Chinese immigrants in the cities, because they generally didn't widespread all over the town, but they settle on a particular area, and we generally call it Chinatown because there is a strong concentration of Chinese immigrants. And about the history of Bologna that I know better than the London one, I know that at the beginning the area where the Chinese immigrants were located was in the historical center in an area named Borgo Casse that is quite close to Via Marconi. That during this World War II the area was completely destroyed, and then in the post-war period they create a new area, and they settled in a new part of the city that is around Via Ferrarese, where the communities grew up. And in this area, we can find on a geographical approach both the social integration and the economic integration, because the houses of the Chinese immigrants were very close to their economic activities, as shop, stores, plants, and recently restaurants, and so on. That are my comments to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? We can collect the questions and then you can reply.
Yes. Yes, because I was looking for this observation, because could be, I can show you this one. No, it's an answer, of course.
No, I was connected.
No, but yes, I'm funny for definition.
No.
No. Okay, I want to explain that globalization it's not refers only to the problem of workers, but to the phenomenon of globalization of the family. In fact, this is the title of my last book that I wrote with Marco Omizzolo. And the problem of statistical sides, it depends on not on the dark, but on the criminal side. Because, for example, Europol defined Puglia, Calabria, criminal hubs. So it's difficult to make any kind of survey to someone who is an agro-mafia, because they kill. If you want to know how many migrants are now in Puglia for the campaign, I can say that in the ghetto de Lignano, now each summer there are 3,000 people, and is only one of the many ghettos there are. The second one, Libera, is a best practice. It's not the model, because it's a good effort, but it's only to develop the culture of loyalty. But you can consider that the law against caporalato, made in 2016, the result is still insignificant, okay? It means that it's not the law of the prohibition of the guilty, but it's the mentality. And the mentality, the use of confiscated building could be good. In fact, Permafab, the factory Sicilian, is in a confiscated building from the mafia. But the most interesting topic for me is the question of ethic goods. Ethics is only a dress, because if the mass production and the dogma of profit is the trend of the market, and the condition of globalization refers to goods and to people and to workers too, because also the globalization of the farmer involves also the worker, the migrant that they moved from Sicilia to Trentino Alto Adige. So the ethic we can decide what is ethic, what does it mean, what is the point of reference, because ethic good could be a good practice, the best practice, but not the main one. And so I think that we can consider in this moment what Interforce said, that the level of attention must be very high, because when we are in a criminal hub, yes, it's a problem for Apulian people, but really it's a problem also for you. And this is the criminal mentality, and for example, the spread of Ndrangheta, Calabrian mafia, that overcome the possibility of Sicilian one and the Napolitan one, now is very, very dangerous for our business market. And I stopped saying that we think that mafia looking for enterprise. Now, the recent investigation demonstrates that enterprise need mafia because it's the easy way to make business as to win the competition.
Thank you. I repeat the question. Are there any questions? Okay, yeah. Maybe later.
Okay, I would thank to the discussant for his comments and his observations. Yes, our case studies, our work is based on case studies. We have a few time to talk about all the case studies we have studied, and about the motivation we can say that the principal motivation was the custom protection by the French and the Bourbons that were in the southern Italy. So the foreign entrepreneurs, they come in the regions of the southern Italy for the lack of competition and for the presence of the availability of raw materials for cheap workers and all those things. They want to produce goods to sell at in a market was better than the market of their country of origin. The links and the ties with the local population, there were two cases. I think we can have Protestants, so all Germans and Austrians, they were isolated for the other people. They were a group of interest and were substantially isolated from other people. On the other hand, we have Catholics, so Frenchmen and other people, Belgian, for example, they have made some companies with other Italian entrepreneurs, and so they made companies to work together. If someone uses the skill in other fields, there were many workers that works in those plants, in those mills. Those Italian workers, then they open an own business industry or about think like this. So they started to produce by themselves in the same fields of production of their original industry. Some business history, yes, is most important for us. We have studied business history of all the regions we have studied. Paolo asked me why we haven't studied Abruzzo, or not the same way we haven't studied Calabria. We can talk about Abruzzo and Calabria, but we have studied those regions, and we have understand that here there were not foreign entrepreneurs, and so we have noticed that Those regions, they have made a worse performance than the other region in which the foreign entrepreneurs were. So Abruzzo was studied by our work, but there were not much to say about Abruzzo and Calabria. Okay, thank you.
So about the geographical distribution of Chinese immigrants. So when they arrived during the interwar periods, they settled down in the city center, and but they spread a little bit in the city center in the sense that there were part of them in Via Polese and another in Via Marsala, so in Via Mascarella. So they were quite distributed in different parts of the city center. And the point is that the first which arrived they chose a location, and after that all the other followed the rest. And when they moved from the city center to the northern periphery of Bologna, and you mentioned Via Ferrarese, this is a more recent wave of migration. It took usually after the 70s. But it is correct to say that after the Second World War, they started to move outside the walls. I mean, Bologna, for people that are not living in Bologna, the distinction for Bologna people is inside or outside the walls. So they move outside the walls in the northern part. First of all, because new houses, new buildings were alike there. And so when they started to buy their flats, they had to buy there. And the other aspect is that the China Club was by chance near Piazza dell'Unità. And so that was a second part of the city where the number of Chinese people started to become important during the 50s and the 60s. Then, when the new migration wave arrived after the open door policy by Deng Xiaoping during the 80s and the 90s, they continued to move in the northern periphery of the city, and I think simply because the older Chinese community was already there. And so I don't think the effect of war destruction and the fact that during the war part of the old city was destroyed played a role in this in the move of the Chinese community outside the walls.
Just briefly, in the case of London, the opposite was true, because Limehouse now is a borough to the east, and it's a Pakistani borough. If you go there, it's in Pakistan, but I have been there because the archive is there, which still contains Chinese documents. But I thought, oh my God, and I went out the tube, it was really shocking. But then they moved to the center, so now they're in Garrett Street, which is near Trafalgar Square, in the Chinatown, which is, I mean, if you go to London and you visit it, it's really in the heart of the city, so it's the opposite. Okay.
And all questions for Chinese case is related also the other cases. So the impression is that when you find your